You know what? I'm about to share something with you that still sends chills down my spine. Even now, my hands tremble just thinking about it. I'm 72, and for the past decade and a half, I've called these remote mountains my home, completely alone. My little cabin sits roughly 12 miles up an abandoned logging trail that barely anyone remembers exists anymore. The county gave up on maintaining it years back, leaving just me, the weekly mail carrier, and the occasional brave hunter who dares navigate the rough terrain with their four-wheel drive. After my husband died, I couldn't handle city life anymore. Too much noise, too many painful memories lurking around every corner. Up here, the soundtrack of my life became wind whispering through ancient pines, creek water dancing over smooth stones, and deer quietly crossing through my yard. It suited me perfectly. My garden provided vegetables, a small flock of chickens gave me eggs, and I'd stockpiled enough firewood to see me through any harsh winter, or at least that's what I believed. Now, that particular October was unusual, unseasonably warm, you might say. Strange, because typically by mid-October I'd already experienced my first frost. But that year, the leaves clung stubbornly to branches well into November, and my tomatoes kept producing like it was still summer. Even my chickens seemed confused, laying more eggs than normal, as if trying to figure out what season it actually was. But listen, the old-timers down in town, they weren't buying it. Every supply run I made, they'd issue the same warnings with unusual intensity.
The wind howled
"Stock up
outside
now,"
the stone walls,
they'd
but
say with
inside,
serious
the
eyes.
fire kept them
"Get that
safe and warm
firewood
through
cut
the
early.
longest night.
Make sure your roof can handle serious weight." When people who've lived through dozens of mountain winters speak with that kind of gravity, you listen. I'd weathered plenty of brutal winters before, but something felt different. The wildlife was acting bizarre. Squirrels working frantically, burying nuts like their lives depended on it. Birds that should have migrated south weeks earlier just lingered, like they couldn't make up their minds. My chickens huddled closer to their coop than usual, making anxious sounds I'd never heard before. By late November, I'd chopped and stacked
And so
more
the travelers
firewood than
realized
ever
they
in
were
my
not
life.
alone in the whispering woods.
My root cellar was
The
packed to
shadows
the
stretched
ceiling.
longer as the fire
Preserved
began to
vegetables,
dim.
canned goods, emergency supplies stacked high, extra chicken feed, backup generator tested and ready. Looking back now, it's like my instincts were screaming at me to prepare for something far beyond an ordinary winter storm. The temperature plummeted without warning. Tuesday morning, I was working outside in just a light jacket. By Wednesday dawn, ice coated my water bottle, and the weather radio crackled with alerts about an unprecedented storm system forming out west, the kind they name and track like hurricanes. That should have been my first real clue that this winter would be unlike anything I'd experienced. December hit us like a freight train. By the third week, we'd already seen more snow than most entire winters combined. Meteorologists kept discussing this massive system moving eastward, calling it a once-in-a-decade event, maybe rarer. Sure, I'd survived bad weather before. I just did what I always do. Double-checked supplies, stacked extra wood near the door, reinforced the chicken coop. But something felt fundamentally wrong from the start. The air pressure dropped so rapidly my ears kept popping. Wind patterns made no sense, coming from directions that usually signaled tornado weather, not blizzards. My chickens completely stopped laying and clustered together, even during daylight hours. And my old bones? They ached in ways they never had before, like they could sense what was coming. Those first flakes started Monday evening, tiny, hard pellets like ice fragments. By Tuesday morning, 6 inches of the driest, lightest snow I'd ever witnessed covered everything. It refused to pack, just blew around like desert sand. The wind remained steady but manageable, constant enough to keep visibility poor and snow perpetually moving. Tuesday became a day of obsessive checking. Chickens had ample food and water, though they seemed agitated about something I couldn't identify. Woodpile covered and accessible. Check. Every window secured tight. Check. Extra kerosene brought inside for the lamps. Check. Generator tested one final time, though I prayed I wouldn't need it. But Tuesday night? That's when the real beast arrived. The transformation around 8 p.m. was incredible to witness. What had been steady, manageable wind suddenly became something alive and furious. My house started making sounds I'd never heard in 15 years, creaking, groaning protests. Snow hammered the windows so hard it sounded like gravel being thrown at the glass. By 10 p.m., I couldn't see my porch light from inside my own kitchen. The snow had stopped falling vertically entirely. Now it moved horizontally, driven by winds that had to be gusting above 60 miles per hour. Century-old trees bent like grass blades, and the sharp crack of them snapping echoed through the howling wind like gunshots. Temperature plunged viciously. My thermometer read 20 degrees at sunset, dropped below zero by midnight, and kept falling. Despite the fire blazing at full blast with every lamp lit, cold seeped through the walls like water through a sieve. No matter how much wood I fed that fire, I could feel the heat being stolen away. By midnight, I knew this was completely different. The wind wasn't howling anymore. It was screaming. Snow fell so thick it formed an impenetrable white wall outside every window. Temperature dropped so fast I could literally feel cold creeping through the walls despite the roaring fire. Power failed around 2 a.m. Not unusual for these mountains, but the timing was terrible. I had candles and oil lamps aplenty, but without the electric heater assisting, the house started losing the battle against the cold rapidly. I threw another log on the fire and tried sleeping, but the noise made it impossible. Trees exploded like bombs going off. Sharp cracks followed by thunderous crashes. Something kept banging rhythmically against the side of my house, though I couldn't identify what. Every few minutes, another massive tree would fall somewhere in the forest, the sound echoing through the mountains like artillery fire. The wind was so deafening I couldn't think straight, and my entire house shook with each powerful gust. Around 3 a.m., I heard something that made my blood freeze. A rhythmic thumping against the back wall, too regular, too purposeful to be random debris in the wind. I grabbed my flashlight and checked every safely accessible window, but the snow was so thick I couldn't see anything at all. That thumping continued for about 20 minutes, then stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving me even more unsettled. By dawn, the storm had settled into a terrifying pattern. Wind would howl for 10 to 15 minutes, then calm to almost nothing, then surge back even stronger than before. During those brief calm periods, I could hear the landscape transforming, snow settling, ice cracking, the sound of a world being completely remade. I managed to force the door open during one calmer moment and stepped into a world I didn't recognize. Snow already stood 3 feet deep and falling hard. My truck had vanished completely. Just a white mound where I knew I'd parked it. The path to the chicken coop had disappeared entirely, and the coop itself was half buried in a massive drift. The chickens were still alive. I could hear them clucking anxiously from their shelter, but reaching them safely was impossible. I'd have to wait for the storm to pass, then dig them out. At least the coop was sturdy and well insulated. They'd be cold and terrified, but they'd survive. They had to. Wednesday proved even worse than Tuesday night. The storm intensified overnight, and now snow fell so fast I couldn't see my own hand extended in front of my face. Wind became constant, No more calm periods, just endless howling that shook my house to its foundation. I spent that day feeding the fire and checking obsessively for leaks or structural damage. The roof held, but I could hear ice building up dangerously in the gutters. Several windows developed frost on the inside despite the fire blazing away. The cold was winning, slowly but inevitably. Around noon, that banging started again, this time on the front of the house, near the door. Rhythmic thumping, like something deliberately trying to get inside. I peered through every window I could reach, but saw nothing except swirling white chaos. The sound continued for hours, sometimes stopping briefly, then starting again from a different location. I began wondering if it might be an animal, perhaps a deer or elk seeking shelter from the deadly storm. But the sound was too purposeful, too regular. It felt like something was systematically testing my house, checking for weaknesses or entry points. That thought terrified me more than the storm itself. By evening, I started worrying about my supplies. I'd burned through more firewood than anticipated due to the extreme cold, and my lamp oil was depleting faster than expected, too. If this storm lasted much longer, I might need to start rationing heat, a genuinely dangerous prospect. The banging stopped around sunset, but by then my nerves were completely shredded. Every sound the house made had me jumping. Every wind gust sounded like footsteps on the roof. I kept checking the door locks obsessively, even though I knew nothing human could possibly be out there in this apocalyptic weather. Wednesday night became a pure test of endurance. The storm had raged for over 24 hours with no sign of weakening. If anything, it seemed to be intensifying. Wind was so loud I couldn't hear myself think, and cold seeped through every crack and gap in the walls relentlessly. I dragged my mattress into the main room close to the fireplace, warmer than the bedroom, but still cold enough that I needed every blanket I owned piled on top of me. The fire demanded feeding every hour, meaning I never got more than 40 or 50 minutes of sleep at a stretch. Around 10 p.m., I heard something that made my blood run cold. Crying. Not wind, not tree branches rubbing together. Actual crying, like a baby's wail, but deeper somehow, more resonant. At first, I convinced myself the storm was playing tricks on my ears, but the sound continued even during brief moments when the wind died down. The crying seemed to originate from somewhere right outside the house, faint but persistent, rising and falling like an infant's distressed cry, but with an undertone that was definitely not human. My first thought was maybe a wild cat or some other animal, but I'd never heard anything remotely like it in 15 years up here. I tried ignoring it, tried sleeping, but that sound kept pulling at something deep inside me. There was a quality to it that was profoundly distressing, something that seemed to reach right into my chest and squeeze my heart. This wasn't just an animal in distress. It was the sound of something young, helpless, and absolutely terrified. The second night grew worse. The storm refused to quit. I'd been through my routine, fire checked, windows inspected for dangerous ice buildup, everything checked for leaks. I was getting ready for bed when I heard something that stopped me dead in my tracks. The crying was clearer now, definitely coming from right outside my house. During a brief lull in the wind, I could hear it plainly. Two distinct voices, both young, both in terrible distress. The sounds they made weren't quite like anything I'd encountered before, but the raw emotion behind them was unmistakable. Whatever was out there was cold, scared, and probably dying. I grabbed my flashlight and heavy coat. Every ounce of common sense screamed at me to stay inside, but something about that sound pulled irresistibly at me. It was the kind of crying that meant something was hurt and scared, I'd raised 3 children and helped with countless grandchildren over the years. That maternal instinct to respond to a baby's cry was too powerful to ignore, even knowing the danger. The cold hit me like a physical punch when I opened that door. Wind tried tearing the flashlight right out of my hands, and snow was so thick I could barely draw breath. But the crying was clearer now, coming from the side of the house where the foundation met the ground. I followed that sound, stepping carefully, because snow was already past my knees in most places and over my waist where it had drifted. Wind kept trying to knock me off balance, and several times I had to grab the side of the house to avoid falling. My flashlight beam barely penetrated the swirling white chaos. When I finally reached the side of the cabin, my flashlight caught something dark huddled against the stone foundation. At first, I thought it was debris, branches or trash blown in by the storm. Then it moved, and I realized I was looking at something alive. There were 2 of them, pressed together against the frozen stone for whatever minimal warmth it might provide. They were small, maybe the size of 3-year-old children, but their proportions were completely wrong. Arms and legs too long, torsos too broad. They were covered in dark brown fur that was matted and stiff with ice crystals, sparkling in my flashlight beam. But their faces— oh God, their faces stopped me cold. Not quite human, not quite animal. Something in between. The bone structure was more human than ape, but the proportions were different. Larger eye sockets, more pronounced brow ridge, flatter nose. Their eyes were enormous and dark, and when they looked up at me, I saw real intelligence there. Not animal cunning, something much deeper, much more complex. They were dying. I could see it immediately. Their breathing was shallow and labored, bodies shaking so violently they could barely stay upright. Ice had formed everywhere on them. On their fur, their eyelashes, even around their nostrils, where their desperate breath froze instantly. Whatever these creatures were, they were just babies, and they were freezing to death against my house. I didn't stop to think about what they might be, or whether they could be dangerous. All I saw were 2 small, helpless creatures desperately needing help. That maternal instinct that had driven me outside became stronger than any fear or confusion about what I was looking at. I pulled off my heavy coat and wrapped it around both of them as best I could. They didn't resist or try running away. If anything, they seemed to understand I was trying to help. They made soft whimpering sounds and pressed closer to my warmth, their small hands. And they were definitely hands, with opposable thumbs and individual fingers clutching desperately at my clothes. They were heavier than I expected, dense and solid like well-fed children, but I managed to lift them both. One was noticeably smaller, maybe a year younger, and seemed weaker. The larger one kept making soft sounds to its companion, as if trying to offer reassurance or comfort. Getting them inside was a brutal struggle. Wind kept trying to knock me off balance, and I couldn't see much with both hands full, and my flashlight tucked awkwardly under my arm. Snow blew directly into my face, blinding me. More than once, I had to stop and feel my way along the wall to make sure I was heading in the right direction. When I finally got that door open and stumbled into the relative warmth of my cabin, the contrast was overwhelming. The creatures in my arms seemed to feel it immediately. Their shivering intensified at first, like their bodies were shocked by the temperature change, then gradually began to ease. I set them down directly in front of the fireplace and wrapped them in every blanket I could find. Their fur felt like touching ice, and they were shivering so violently I feared they might be having some kind of seizure. Ice crystals covered everything, their fur, eyelashes around their nostrils and mouths, sparkling in the firelight like cruel decorations. I built up the fire as much as I dared, without risking burns, and moved them as close as possible to the flames. They seemed to understand what fire was and didn't try touching it, but they pressed as close as they could get, holding their hands out toward that blessed warmth. Their hands fascinated and disturbed me in equal measure. Definitely not human, but absolutely not animal paws either. The fingers were longer than human fingers, with an extra joint that allowed them to bend in ways mine couldn't. The thumbs were positioned differently, too, giving them a grip that looked incredibly strong and versatile. I warmed some milk on the wood stove, testing it carefully to ensure it wasn't too hot. When I offered it to them, they looked at the cup with obvious intelligence, clearly understanding what I was offering, but uncertain whether to trust me. The larger creature reached out tentatively and touched the cup, then pulled its hand back as if testing the temperature. Finding it acceptable, it took the cup in both hands and drank slowly, watching me over the rim with those enormous, dark, intelligent eyes. The smaller one hesitated. It looked back and forth between me and its companion, clearly wanting the warmth and nourishment but afraid to accept it. The larger one made soft sounds to it, a kind of gentle cooing that seemed to be encouragement. Finally, the smaller one accepted its own cup and drank. I gave them small pieces of bread and some leftover soup I'd warmed on the stove. They ate carefully, examining each piece of food before putting it in their mouths. Their table manners were surprisingly refined. They didn't grab or snatch, and they seemed to naturally understand the concept of sharing. What struck me most powerfully was how they communicated with each other. They made soft sounds, not quite language, but definitely meaningful. The larger one seemed protective of the smaller one, offering it food first, making sure it stayed close to the fire, touching it gently when it seemed frightened. They never took their eyes off me while they ate, not in an aggressive or threatening way, but with intense curiosity. They were studying me just as carefully as I was studying them, trying to figure out what I was and whether I meant them any harm. When they'd eaten enough to satisfy their immediate hunger, they huddled together near the fire and seemed to truly relax for the first time since I'd brought them inside. Their violent shivering had stopped, and their breathing had become deeper and more regular. The smaller one actually fell asleep, curled against its companion's side like any exhausted child. I didn't sleep at all that first night. I kept the fire going and watched them breathe, making absolutely sure they were warming up and getting stronger. Part of me was terrified. I mean, what were these things? Where had they come from? Were there more of them? But mostly, I just felt this overwhelming protective instinct. They were so small and vulnerable, and they'd been so close to death when I found them. Around dawn, their condition had improved dramatically. They were no longer shivering, and their fur had dried out and fluffed up, making them look larger and healthier. They seemed stronger, too, more alert and curious about their surroundings. The larger one got up and began exploring my cabin with careful deliberation, moving gently and touching things with obvious curiosity. It seemed particularly fascinated by my books, running its fingers over the covers and opening them to look at the pages. It obviously couldn't read, but it seemed to understand that the marks on the paper meant something, carried information. The smaller one stayed close to the fire but watched everything its companion did with keen interest. When the larger one found a small hand mirror on my dresser, both of them were absolutely fascinated by their reflections. They touched the glass gently, then looked behind the mirror to see where the images were coming from, trying to solve the mystery. Their intelligence was undeniable and profound. These weren't just clever animals. They were thinking, reasoning beings with curiosity and genuine problem-solving abilities. When they encountered something they didn't understand, they didn't react purely on instinct. They studied it, experimented with it, tried systematically to figure out how it worked. Around mid-morning, they started making different sounds, softer, more musical tones that seemed directed at me specifically. It took me a while to realize they were trying to communicate gratitude. The larger one kept pointing to itself, then to its companion, then to me, making gentle sounds with each gesture, as if trying to explain what had happened and express thanks. I started talking to them, keeping my voice soft and calm. They seemed to genuinely enjoy the sound of human speech, even though they couldn't possibly understand the words. They'd tilt their heads and listen intently, sometimes making soft responses that sounded almost like they were trying to join the conversation, to participate in this ritual of communication. The blizzard raged on for 2 more days. Wind never stopped completely, and snow continued falling at a rate I'd never witnessed in my life. By Thursday morning, I couldn't see the chicken coop anymore. It was completely buried under a drift that had to be 8 or 9 feet deep at least. The creatures, I'd started thinking of them as children somehow, settled into a routine with surprising ease. They helped me tend the fire, bringing me small pieces of wood from the pile by the door. They seemed to instinctively understand that fire was essential for warmth and survival, and they were careful never to let it burn too low. They watched everything I did with intense concentration, as if trying to learn how human things worked, studying the patterns of my daily life. When I cooked, they stood nearby and observed every step of the process with fascination. When I read, they sat quietly and listened to the sound of my voice, sometimes making soft sounds that seemed like questions or comments or attempts to understand. The smaller one was shyer than its companion, but also more affectionate. It would sit close to me while I worked on small tasks, sometimes reaching out to touch my hand or arm gently, seeking reassurance or connection. The larger one was more independent and curious, always exploring something new or trying to figure out how things worked, pushing boundaries of understanding. They learned with incredible speed. By the second day, they understood basic cause and effect relationships around the cabin. They knew wood made fire burn brighter, fire created warmth. Warmth was good and necessary for life. They knew certain sounds I made meant I was pleased with them, and others meant I wanted them to be careful or stop what they were doing. Most amazingly, they seemed to understand the concept of helping without being asked or trained. They started anticipating what I needed and trying to provide it. If I was struggling to reach something, one of them would get it for me. If I was working on a task that required multiple hands, they'd step in to assist without prompting. Their concern for each other was genuinely touching to watch. The larger one constantly checked on its smaller companion, making sure it was warm enough, had eaten enough, felt safe enough. The smaller one looked to its companion for guidance and reassurance, but also showed remarkable independence for something so young and in such a strange situation. By Thursday evening, having them there felt completely natural. They'd found their places in the cabin's daily routine, and their presence was comforting rather than frightening. When I sat by the fire to read in the evening, they'd settle down nearby, the smaller one often falling asleep against my leg, while the larger one listened attentively to my voice as if the sound itself brought comfort. Friday morning, I woke to an unusual silence. The storm hadn't stopped completely, but the wind had died down enough that I could hear individual sounds again. Snow settling, tree branches creaking, the distant call of a bird that had somehow survived the apocalyptic blizzard. The creatures sensed the change immediately. They went to the windows and looked out at the transformed, snow-covered landscape, then back at me, then at the door. For the first time since I'd brought them inside, they seemed restless, even agitated, like something was calling to them. I bundled up and went outside to assess the damage and check on my poor chickens. The world had been completely transformed, unrecognizable. Snow piled higher than my head in some places, and familiar landmarks of my property were buried or rendered unidentifiable. Several large trees had come down, and my usual paths were completely impassable. The creatures followed me to the door, but wouldn't step outside into the snow. They stood in the doorway, sniffing the air intently, and making soft sounds to each other that seemed different from their usual communication. There was an urgency to their behavior that made me nervous, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly why. The chickens had survived, though they were cold and clearly traumatized. Their water had frozen completely solid, and they'd consumed most of their emergency food supply. I spent an hour digging them out and making sure they had fresh food and water, all while the two creatures watched from the doorway with obvious concern in their enormous eyes. That's when I saw the tracks. They were enormous, at least 18 inches long and 8 inches wide at their widest point. They looked almost human in basic structure, but with much longer toes and what appeared to be claw marks at the tips. The stride length was incredible, too, suggesting something much taller and far more powerful than any human. The tracks came from deep in the forest, wound around my house several times in a deliberate pattern, then headed back into the woods in a different direction. They were fresh, made some time after the snow had stopped falling, but before I'd come outside that morning. Something large had been systematically checking out my property while I slept, and the realization made my heart pound. I followed the tracks with my eyes as far as I could see into the forest. They moved in a purposeful, intelligent pattern, not wandering or meandering like an animal's tracks might. Whoever or whatever had made them knew exactly where they were going and what they were searching for. The tracks went right up to my walls, under my windows, around to the exact spot where I'd found the two small creatures dying in the snow. Then they circled the house twice, checking, confirming, before heading back into the deep woods in a perfectly straight line. My heart started racing as the implications crashed over me like a wave. These tracks belonged to the family of the creatures I'd rescued. Parents, siblings, maybe an entire group had come searching for their missing babies. They'd found the house where their children were being sheltered, somehow confirmed they were safe and being cared for, and then retreated to wait. I looked back at the two small faces watching me anxiously from the doorway. They were making new sounds now, not quite whimpering, not quite calling, but something in between. Their whole bodies were tense with anticipation, and they kept looking toward the woods where the massive tracks disappeared into shadow. The larger one came outside for the first time, stepping carefully in the deep snow, but moving with obvious purpose toward the edge of the forest. It stopped about 20 feet from the house and made a series of calls, louder than any sounds I'd heard from either of them before, carrying clearly through the still morning air. From somewhere deep in the woods came an answering call, low and resonant, unmistakably similar to what the young one had made, but much deeper and infinitely more powerful. The sound seemed to come from multiple directions at once, as if several large creatures were spread out strategically through the forest, surrounding my property. The smaller creature joined its companion outside, and both of them began making excited sounds toward the woods, their whole bodies vibrating with emotion. They were talking to their family, I realized with wonder, letting them know they were alive and well, probably explaining what had happened to them, describing this strange human who had saved their lives. The sounds from the forest grew closer and more numerous. What had started as distant calls became a complex, layered conversation involving multiple voices of different pitches and tones. Some were definitely adult voices, deep and powerful, resonating through the trees. Others sounded younger, possibly adolescents or other children in the family group. I could hear movement in the woods now, the sound of large bodies pushing through snow and undergrowth with deliberate purpose. branches breaking, snow falling from disturbed pine boughs. Whatever was out there, there were many of them, and they were big. The two young creatures became increasingly excited as their family approached, practically dancing in the snow, making joyful sounds, gesturing toward the house, toward me, toward the woods, telling their incredible story of survival. Then I saw the first adult emerge from behind a massive pine tree about 50 yards away. Even at that distance, its size was absolutely overwhelming. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, with shoulders broader than any human I'd ever seen or imagined. Its body was covered in the same dark brown fur as the young ones, but there was nothing childlike or gentle about its build or bearing. It looked directly at me and went perfectly, utterly still, studying me with unmistakable intelligence and wariness. I felt like I was being carefully evaluated, assessed for threat level and intent, judged in ways I couldn't fully understand. The two young creatures started running toward it, calling out in excited voices, but the adult held up one enormous hand in an unmistakable gesture, and they stopped immediately, obediently. This was clearly someone used to being obeyed, a leader. More adults appeared between the trees, materializing from the shadows like spirits. I lost count after a dozen, but there were definitely more than that, perhaps 20 or more. They moved silently despite their massive size, positioning themselves in a loose but clearly coordinated circle around my property. This was tactical thinking, the kind that required sophisticated communication and strategic planning. The largest one, obviously the leader of the group, stepped forward with deliberate purpose. It was even bigger than the others, maybe 9 feet tall, with visible scars across its chest and arms that spoke of a long, hard, dangerous life. Its eyes were the same dark color as the young ones, but there was nothing gentle or uncertain about its expression. This was a being that had survived countless challenges. The leader approached slowly and deliberately, each step clearly calculated and controlled. It never took its eyes off me, and I could see it was ready to react instantly if I made any threatening moves. The other adults maintained their positions in the circle, effectively surrounding me completely, though they kept their distance, a show of force, but not aggression. Not yet. When the leader was about 20 feet away, it stopped and made a sound I'll never forget as long as I live. A deep, rumbling vocalization that seemed to come from its chest rather than its throat. It wasn't quite a growl, but it was definitely a sound of authority and immense power, a voice that commanded respect. The two young creatures responded immediately, moving to a position halfway between me and their leader, a bridge between two worlds. They began making rapid, excited sounds, gesturing toward me, toward the house, toward themselves, their hands moving expressively. They were telling their story, I realized, explaining how they'd been caught in the storm, how I'd found them dying against my foundation, how I'd brought them inside, fed them, kept them warm, saved their lives. The leader listened without interrupting, its gaze never leaving my face for even a second. I could see it processing the information carefully, trying to understand the relationship between its children and this strange human who had sheltered them from death. Other adults moved closer during this explanation, near enough that I could see the intelligence burning in their eyes, the family resemblances between them and the young ones I'd cared for. Some were clearly females, slightly smaller builds, more delicate features. Others were obviously males, larger, more heavily muscled, radiating protective power. What struck me most forcefully was how remarkably human-like their behavior was, despite their clearly non-human appearance. They stood upright naturally, used their hands expressively while communicating, showed clear, complex emotional responses to what the young ones were telling them. This wasn't just a group of animals acting on instinct. This was a family with all the intricate relationships and emotional dynamics that word implies. The leader continued studying me intently while the young ones finished their story. When they were done, it looked back and forth between them and me several times, visibly processing the information and coming to some kind of decision. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. Then something remarkable happened, something I'll treasure for the rest of my life. One of the young creatures, the larger, braver one that had been more confident throughout their stay, ran back to me and took my hand in its own. It led me forward a few steps, then gestured toward its family leader while making soft, musical sounds that carried clearly in the cold air. I understood immediately what it was doing. It was introducing me, vouching for me, making it absolutely clear to its family that I was a friend rather than a threat, that I could be trusted. The smaller one joined us without hesitation, taking my other hand and adding its own voice to the introduction, supporting its companion's testimony about my character and actions. The leader's expression began to change gradually. The wariness didn't disappear completely. You don't survive to lead a family group by being careless. But it was joined by something that might have been gratitude or respect or recognition of a debt owed. It looked at its children, both obviously healthy and completely unharmed despite their ordeal, then back at me with those impossibly dark, intelligent eyes. Slowly, deliberately, with immense dignity, the massive creature lowered its head toward me. It wasn't quite a bow, but it was definitely a gesture of acknowledgement and respect, a recognition that I had helped its children when they desperately needed it, that I had given them their lives back. One by one, every single adult in the group did the same thing. A dozen enormous heads lowering in my direction, a moment of profound recognition that transcended species boundaries completely. It was the most intense, meaningful nonverbal communication I'd ever experienced in my entire life. After that moment of acknowledgement, that brief, perfect connection between species, the leader gently but firmly called its children. Forward. They looked back at me with obvious reluctance, making sounds that seemed like attempts to explain or apologize for having to leave, for ending this strange interlude. I knelt down in the snow and let them approach me one final time. The smaller one pressed against me briefly, making a soft sound that could only be described as affectionate, filled with emotion. The larger one touched my face gently with one hand, then made a complex series of sounds that felt like a thank you in any language, universal in its meaning. I tried to speak to them, to let them know that caring for them had been my privilege, not my burden, that they had given me far more than I had given them. I don't think they understood my specific words, but they seemed to understand my tone and intent perfectly well. Both of them touched my hands one final time before stepping back toward their waiting family, looking back at me every few steps as if memorizing my face. The leader made a low sound, and immediately the entire group began moving toward the forest with coordinated precision. The young ones stayed close to their parents, but they kept looking back at me until the trees blocked them from view completely. Within minutes, they had vanished entirely. The forest swallowed them up as if they had never been there at all, as if the whole thing had been an impossible dream. If not for the tracks in the snow and the memories burned forever into my mind, I might have convinced myself it was exactly that, a hallucination brought on by isolation and storm stress. The silence after they left was absolutely deafening. For 4 days my cabin had been filled with soft sounds, gentle movement, the presence of beings who were learning and growing and communicating. Now it was just me again, alone, and that quiet felt oppressive and heavy. I spent the rest of that day in a daze, going through the motions of normal activities, but unable to stop thinking about what I'd experienced. The cabin felt huge and empty without my small visitors. I kept expecting to hear their soft calls or see them carefully bringing me pieces of wood for the fire. That night, sleep was impossible. I kept replaying every single moment of the encounter in my mind, from finding them nearly frozen to death to watching them disappear into the forest with their family. Had it really happened? The rational part of my mind insisted it must have been some kind of hallucination, a trick of stress and isolation. But the evidence was undeniable and concrete. The blankets they'd used still carried a different scent, wild and outdoor, not quite like any animal I knew. The cups they'd drunk from were exactly where I'd left them after washing. And most convincingly, their tracks were still perfectly visible in the snow around the house, alongside the enormous prints of their adult family members. I realized I'd been changed by the experience in ways I was only beginning to understand and process. For 4 days, I'd been responsible for 2 beings who were entirely dependent on me for survival. I'd felt protective, maternal, connected to something larger than myself, in a way I hadn't experienced since my own children were young, since I'd had purpose beyond mere survival. Over the next few days and weeks, I found myself constantly looking for signs of my former guests, scanning the tree line obsessively. Sometimes I thought I caught glimpses of movement in the distant trees, but I was never sure if it was them or just shadows and desperately wishful thinking. Small things around my property began to change in ways that made me wonder and hope. My woodpile, which had been somewhat haphazardly stacked, appeared more organized and stable when I went out for fuel. Fallen branches that had been blocking important paths were moved aside overnight, though I hadn't touched them. Most significantly and mysteriously, I started finding small offerings at the edge of my property. Smooth stones arranged in deliberate patterns, bundles of dried berries still fresh somehow, pieces of bark with interesting natural designs carved or grown into them. They appeared overnight consistently and were always placed where I'd be absolutely sure to notice them during my daily routines, like messages left specifically for me. I began leaving offerings of my own, pieces of bread, fruit from my dwindling pantry, sometimes small tools or bright objects that I thought might interest them, might be useful to beings living in the forest. They were always gone by morning, though I suppose that could have been any number of forest animals. But I didn't think so. The sense of being watched wasn't frightening at all. It felt protective, comforting even. I had the distinct, undeniable impression that my property was being actively guarded, that something intelligent and powerful was looking out for me the way I had looked out for 2 young ones during that terrible storm. As winter slowly progressed into spring, my understanding of what had happened continued to evolve and deepen. I'd encountered a family of beings that most people would consider mythological, legendary, impossible, but they were as real as the trees and mountains around me, as real as the air I breathed. They had intelligence, complex emotions, deep family bonds, and sophisticated social structures that paralleled human society in remarkable ways. More than that, they had demonstrated something truly profound that transcended species boundaries completely: the ability to recognize genuine kindness and respond with heartfelt gratitude. The brief time I'd spent caring for their young ones had created a bond that continued long after they had returned to their forest home, a connection that enriched both our lives. Spring brought new and wonderful evidence of their continued presence and attention. Wildflowers appeared in my garden in patterns far too deliberate and artistic to be natural. My vegetable seedlings were protected from late frosts by carefully placed pine boughs that I absolutely hadn't put there. The chicken coop, which had suffered significant storm damage, was mysteriously and expertly repaired one night with materials and techniques I didn't recognize but admired. I began to understand on a deeper level that I was no longer just a solitary human living alone in the mountains. I was part of a larger, more complex community, one that included neighbors I would probably never see clearly in daylight, but who were watching over me with care nonetheless. The thought should have been unsettling, should have frightened me. Instead, it was deeply, profoundly comforting. Summer brought even more subtle but unmistakable signs of my unseen neighbor's presence and care. Paths through the forest that I used regularly were kept mysteriously clear of fallen branches and debris. Dangerous areas where erosion had made footing treacherous were carefully marked with deliberately placed stones or distinctive sticks. It was as if someone intelligent was actively maintaining the entire mountain specifically for my safety and convenience. The offerings continued, too, evolving beautifully with the seasons like an ongoing conversation. Summer brought carefully arranged piles of berries and edible plants, always varieties I recognized as safe and nutritious, never anything questionable. Fall brought nuts and seeds, meticulously sorted and cleaned with obvious care. The presentation was always thoughtful, arranged in ways that showed genuine consideration and maybe even affection. I started spending significantly more time outdoors, partly hoping for another glimpse of my mysterious neighbors, but mostly because the forest felt safer and more welcoming than it ever had in all my years here. I would sit on my porch in the evenings and sometimes hear distant sounds. Not quite voices, not random forest noise either, but something in between. Conversations, perhaps, or maybe songs carried on the wind. The chickens had become remarkably braver, too, venturing farther from their co-op than they ever had before, ranging freely without fear. It was as if they somehow sensed the protective presence in the forest and knew instinctively they were safe from predators. Indeed, I never lost a single bird to foxes or hawks that entire summer, despite them ranging freely through areas where losses had been frustratingly common in previous years. When December came around again, I found myself thinking constantly, obsessively about the anniversary of my incredible encounter. A full year had passed since that once-in-a-lifetime blizzard, since I'd found two small creatures dying in the snow and changed both their lives and mine forever in ways I'm still discovering. The winter was milder that year, regular snowfalls, cold temperatures, but nothing approaching the apocalyptic ferocity of the previous year's historic storm. I was almost disappointed, if I'm being honest. Part of me had been secretly hoping for another opportunity to help, another chance to demonstrate that humans could be trusted, that kindness could bridge impossible gaps. On the exact anniversary of the night I'd found them dying against my foundation, I heard hauntingly familiar sounds outside my cabin, not crying this time, no distress or fear, but soft, deliberate calls that I recognized immediately, that made my heart leap. I looked out the window with trembling hands and saw fresh tracks in the new snow. Not the enormous adult prints I'd seen that day in the spring, but smaller ones, young adult size, perhaps, or late adolescent, beings who had grown but weren't yet fully mature. I put on my coat with shaking hands and went outside, following the tracks to the edge of my property with my heart pounding. There, barely visible in the pale moonlight, were two figures standing at the tree line, watching my house. They were much larger than they'd been as helpless babies, but still noticeably smaller than the adults I'd seen that transformative day. The same two children, now nearly grown, independent, strong. They didn't approach the house, didn't try to come closer, but they stood there for several long, precious minutes, occasionally making soft sounds in my direction that carried clearly in the cold night air. I had the distinct, powerful impression they were saying hello, checking on me with genuine concern, letting me know they were well and thriving and hadn't forgotten what I'd done for them, that they remembered. I called out softly, thanking them for coming, telling them how incredibly good it was to see them again, how much it meant to me. They seemed to understand my tone perfectly, even if my specific words were meaningless to them. One of them, I thought it might be the smaller one from that year before, though it was hard to tell in the dim light, raised what might have been a hand in something that looked remarkably, unmistakably like a wave. Then they melted back into the forest smoothly, leaving only their tracks and my overwhelming sense of gratitude and joy for this brief but meaningful reunion. That visit established a pattern that has continued for years now, a beautiful tradition. Every winter, usually around the anniversary of our first meeting, I receive some sign that they remember, that I matter to them as they matter to me. Sometimes it's tracks in fresh snow, sometimes distant calls that I recognize. Once, remarkably, a small pile of pine cones arranged on my porch in a pattern that spelled out what could have been a crude but deliberate attempt at letters or symbols. The protective presence has never left either, never wavered. I've lived through several more harsh winters and difficult summers since then, but I've never felt truly alone or endangered, never faced the dangers of mountain life without support. Food is mysteriously supplemented by wild offerings when my own supplies run dangerously low. Potential hazards around my property are carefully marked or eliminated entirely before I encounter them. My water line, which should have frozen solid during particularly brutal cold spells, somehow never does, protected by methods I don't understand but deeply appreciate. I began to realize on a profound level that what I'd experienced wasn't just a random chance encounter. It was an adoption of sorts, a joining of families across species lines. By saving their children from certain death, I'd become part of their extended family in ways that continued to reveal themselves. The unspoken rules and obligations that govern their relationships with each other now apply to me as well, and I to them. This understanding has brought both deep comfort and genuine responsibility. I'm careful never to abuse the protection I'm receiving, never to take unnecessary risks or behave in ways that might endanger my unseen guardians or take advantage of their care. I also make absolutely sure to continue offering what I can in return. Food when I have extra simple tools that might be useful, bright objects that might be interesting or valuable to them. Soon, very soon now, I'll have to pack up my few remaining possessions and leave this mountain for the last time. Age and health have finally caught up with me in ways I can't ignore anymore. I'll move to a small apartment in town where I can receive the medical care and daily assistance that my failing body increasingly requires. It will be comfortable and safe and probably extend my life by years. But it won't be home. Not really. The life I've lived here, the profound relationship we've shared across this impossible bridge between species, this has been the greatest privilege of my entire existence, the thing I'm most proud of in a long life. To be trusted by beings who have every logical reason to fear and avoid humans completely, to be accepted as family by a species not my own, by beings most people would call monsters or myths. I genuinely can't imagine a greater honor or more meaningful connection. So, that's my story. That's what happened to me in these mountains that I'll be leaving soon. Make of it what you will. Believe it or don't, I suppose it doesn't really matter now. But if you're ever alone in the wilderness and you hear something calling for help in the night, I genuinely hope you'll remember that courage isn't the absence of fear or uncertainty. True courage is doing the right thing even when you're absolutely terrified, even when you don't understand what you're dealing with, even when every instinct screams at you to protect yourself first. Because sometimes, just sometimes, that moment of bravery, that choice to help rather than hide, can change everything. For them, yes. But for you too, in ways you can't possibly imagine until it happens. And if you want to hear more incredible stories like this one, stories that challenge what you think you know about the world, well, you know what to do.